Carl Jung's most alarming psychological finding didn't emerge from studying illness, it came from studying perception. Specifically, it involved people who see what others can't. These individuals don't just notice micro-expressions or shifts in mood. They perceive the entire emotional and psychological landscape hidden beneath social masks. Jung referred to this as differentiated perception, a capacity to detect unconscious tensions, hidden motivations, and emotional undercurrents that go completely unnoticed by most. It wasn't simply a unique gift. It was a deeply isolating and often destructive one. In his clinical work, Jung encountered patients who had this rare gift. They didn't just observe, they felt everything. They could step into a room and instantly sense who was being dishonest, who was suppressing pain, and who held quiet resentment. Jung described how these individuals often suffered more than they benefited from this sensitivity. Their perception created a wall between them and the world. Not because they were mentally unwell, but because they perceived too much to live comfortably in a society built on shared illusions. One case from 1913, during Jung's own psychological struggle following his break from Freud, involved a profoundly introverted, intuitive woman. She had what Jung would call undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could enter any space and pick up on subtle emotional patterns, often more accurately than the individuals themselves could articulate. Jung observed that while this gave her profound insight into others, it came at the cost of normal human connection. She couldn't engage in casual conversations without seeing through others' facades. Friendships were strained because people felt exposed in her presence. She struggled to hold a job. Her mere presence disrupted the unspoken emotional agreements that keep group dynamics functioning. This wasn't pathology. It was the psychological effect of consciousness outpacing collective readiness. Jung realized he wasn't treating a disorder. He was witnessing the cost of advanced perception in a world that prefers comfort over clarity. He documented how this patient described people in disturbingly accurate ways, as though she had access to their innermost thoughts. Jung, through verification and interviews, found that her assessments were nearly always correct. This wasn't delusion or hallucination. It was hyperconsciousness. And it led Jung to an even more unsettling discovery. These individuals didn't just sense things, they absorbed unconscious material from others. This process, which Jung later named participation mystique, meant they were psychologically open to emotional and psychic content others weren't even aware of. Jung wrote, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment." Modern psychology validates this today. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive persons, HSPs, shows that about 20% of people possess heightened emotional and sensory awareness. But Jung's observations went deeper. He focused on a rarer group. He called them introverted intuitives, comprising around 1% of the population. These individuals don't just feel. They detect invisible psychological threads that most miss entirely. Jung described these introverted intuitives as possessing what he called a differentiated intuitive function. Their brains don't just process surface-level information. They decode unconscious signals, emotional residue, repressed desires, psychological distortions. For instance, they might sense the despair masked by someone's laughter or detect fear behind a colleague's calm demeanor. They pick up on the collective shadows, those hidden truths that social groups silently agree to ignore. While others navigate life by interpreting what's said or shown, these individuals are tuned to what's left unsaid. What leaks through in glances, silences, and body tension. But this perception comes at a price. Jung noted that the danger doesn't lie in the ability itself, but in what it does to the individual's relationship with society. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, Jung wrote, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into. The problem is not just social discomfort. it's existential isolation. These individuals often become scapegoats, not because they've done something wrong, but because their very presence reflects truths others are desperate to avoid. Jung called this the problem of the superior function, when your greatest psychological gift becomes the source of your greatest suffering. It separates you from others. It renders ordinary relationships difficult, if not impossible. And worse, it makes you a target. People unconsciously project their unacknowledged emotions, their shadow content, onto the perceptive individual. Instead of facing their own hidden flaws, people blame the one who sees them. He documented countless cases of this projection. His patients would report that when they expressed concern about someone's well-being, they'd be accused of being negative. When they pointed out tension in a group, they were told they were overreacting. Jung concluded this wasn't random, it was a defense mechanism. In Memory's Dreams, Reflections, he stated, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But most people avoid that discomfort. They'd rather destroy the mirror than look into it. This created what Jung termed the scapegoat phenomenon. Those with superior perception are often blamed for the very dysfunctions they reveal. They become, as Jung wrote, the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. The tragedy is not just that they're misunderstood, it's that they're systematically targeted. Their insight becomes their burden. But Jung didn't stop at observation. He studied patterns in these individuals and found that not all highly perceptive people were the same. He identified 4 psychological subtypes among introverted intuitives, each with its own way of processing unconscious content. These weren't theoretical constructs, they were patterns he observed in his clinical practice over decades. The first type Jung identified was the feeling intuitive. This person doesn't just see psychological undercurrents, they feel them viscerally. Their body becomes a receptor for others' unexpressed emotions. They can walk into a room and feel anxious only to realize later that someone else was harboring that emotion. Over time, they can lose touch with their own emotional baseline, constantly absorbing and reflecting the emotional states of those around them. The second subtype Jung identified was the thinking intuitive. These individuals possess an uncanny ability to perceive not only emotional patterns, but also psychological logic, often forecasting events long before others even sense a problem. They might predict relationship breakdowns, workplace meltdowns, or personal crises, not through conscious deduction, but through an unconscious synthesis of emotional data. Jung observed that this type didn't operate like a traditional analyst. Instead, they perceived the future as if it were unfolding in slow motion before anyone else could notice. It was less of a logical deduction and more of a silent recognition. Jung wrote, they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. This didn't make them fortune tellers, it made them extremely psychologically astute. But as with the other types, this gift often isolated them. People don't like to be told their future if it contradicts their illusions, especially when it's accurate. The third type, according to Jung, was the sensation intuitive. These individuals experience the psychological content of others in their bodies. But unlike the feeling intuitive, their perceptions are deeply physical. They can detect physical symptoms before they're acknowledged, notice fatigue before it's confessed, feel a tightness in their own chest that corresponds to someone else's stress. Jung described them as early warning systems for psychological or physiological distress. Their bodies become antennas for the emotional states of their environment. Jung emphasized that this sensitivity wasn't limited to human interaction. The sensation intuitive could even sense environmental tension, unsettling vibes in certain places, emotional imprints left in rooms or buildings. Their intuition was deeply grounded in the sensory world, giving them an earthy, tangible quality that other intuitive types often lacked. The fourth and rarest type was the pure intuitive. This individual saw everything, every emotional, spiritual, and psychological nuance, but had difficulty organizing or expressing what they perceived. They lived in a constant state of overwhelm, flooded with impressions that lacked structure. Jung saw these individuals as possessing extraordinary perception, but without the psychological tools to manage it. They often appeared scattered, erratic, or lost, not because they were broken, but because they were overloaded. Jung observed they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. Understanding which of these four types one aligns with is crucial. Each requires different tools for what Jung called integration, the process of absorbing unconscious material without being destroyed by it. For Jung, this wasn't just a therapeutic suggestion, it was a psychological necessity. He observed three major dangers faced by individuals with superior perception. The first was disruption of the collective unconscious. Highly perceptive individuals threaten the unspoken emotional agreements that allow societies, families, and organizations to function. These agreements are rarely verbalized, but they're understood. Don't mention this. Ignore that, pretend everything's fine. The perceptive individual, by simply existing authentically, violates those agreements. They expose what others need hidden. Jung wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends." It's not that these individuals want to destabilize the group, it's that their honesty is itself destabilizing. Their perception becomes radioactive in environments that rely on repression and denial to survive. The second danger Jung identified was psychological isolation. He called this the curse of the superior function, when your most profound strength becomes your greatest source of loneliness. Jung wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it." These individuals often feel like they live in a parallel dimension, experiencing a level of emotional and psychological reality that others either don't recognize or actively reject. It's not just that others don't understand them, it's that others often can't. This isolation is both social and existential. Many of Jung's patients described feeling like aliens in their own families, communities, or workplaces. Their insights, while accurate, were met with discomfort or hostility. Over time, many withdrew not out of superiority, but out of necessity. It was a defense against being misunderstood, blamed, or scapegoated. Jung noted that this withdrawal can become dangerous if it turns into total detachment from the world. The third and most perilous danger was identity dissolution. Jung observed that those who absorb unconscious content from others often begin to lose touch with their own inner identity. They become flooded with emotional material that doesn't belong to them, yet feels as if it does. This phenomenon, which Jung termed participation mystique, results in the breakdown of psychological boundaries. The individual becomes so merged with the emotional environment around them that they no longer know where they end and others begin. This, Jung wrote, is not just social exile, it's psychological annihilation. It's a collapse of the self into the collective unconscious. The result is often misdiagnosed as anxiety, depression, or even psychosis. But Jung saw it as a spiritual emergency, a signal that the individual's consciousness was trying to evolve in a world unprepared for it. To counter these dangers, Jung developed a path of psychological transformation known as the individuation process. It's a structured journey designed to help highly perceptive individuals retain their identity while engaging with unconscious material, both their own and others. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. And it begins with recognition and differentiation. In the first phase, Jung taught his patients to identify what emotional material was authentically theirs and what had been unconsciously absorbed from their environment. He called this conscious discrimination. Without it, there can be no stable selfhood. Jung wrote, "The first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. To help facilitate this, he recommended periods of daily solitude. In solitude, the noise of the world quiets, and absorbed material has space to settle. It becomes easier to recognize which emotions are foreign and which are true. For highly sensitive individuals, this practice isn't optional, it's survival. The second phase of individuation is shadow integration. Jung observed that those who see others' shadows most clearly often do so because they haven't fully acknowledged their own. When we deny our capacity for jealousy, arrogance, cruelty, or selfishness, we project those traits onto others. The perceptive individual is especially vulnerable to this trap. Jung emphasized that to see others clearly, one must first be willing to look within. Jung described shadow integration as one of the most difficult but necessary steps in psychological development. He famously wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But most people avoid this truth. They project instead of reflect. For the highly perceptive individual, shadow work is even more essential. Without it, their insights into others become distorted by unacknowledged aspects of themselves. Shadow integration means recognizing that you contain the very traits you notice in others. The capacity for manipulation, judgment, fear, or avoidance. This doesn't mean you are defined by these traits, but rather that you're human. It's this acknowledgement that keeps perception from turning into self-righteousness. It grounds insight in humility. When the perceptive person sees the brokenness in others without judgment because they've seen it in themselves, that's when their gift begins to heal rather than harm. The third and final phase of individuation is conscious participation. This is where the individual learns to engage with others' unconscious material without being overwhelmed or absorbed by it. Jung described this state as holding psychological content with awareness, what he called psychological containment. The individuated person doesn't repress or avoid what they perceive. They simply hold it knowing it's not theirs to fix or absorb. This capacity to hold space without becoming enmeshed is what separates conscious perception from psychic overwhelm. It's the difference between drowning in a flood of emotional data and sailing through it with perspective. Jung believed that this was the role of the truly individuated person, to act as a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious, to help others see what lies beneath without losing themselves in the process. Jung also studied historical examples to understand how this process plays out in real life. One case that deeply influenced him was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche possessed what Jung described as unintegrated superior perception. He could see through the facades of society, religion, politics, morality with cutting precision. But instead of integrating this insight into a balanced personality, he used it as a weapon. His clarity turned to rage. His perception, ungrounded by shadow work or conscious humility, eventually contributed to his psychological collapse. Jung wrote that Nietzsche became identified with his superior function. He didn't have the gift, he was the gift. And when that gift overwhelmed him, there was no psychological center left to hold him together. He became consumed by what he saw rather than transformed by it. In contrast, Jung held up Meister Eckhart, the medieval Christian mystic, as an example of successful integration. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, a profound ability to perceive psychological and spiritual truths beyond conventional frameworks. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart used his gift in service of others. His teachings were grounded in compassion, humility, and inner work. He didn't just perceive, he nurtured. Jung noted that Eckhart's success lay in his ability to remain connected to others while holding extraordinary insight. He didn't isolate himself or elevate himself above others. He engaged, he listened, and he taught from a place of deep understanding. Jung wrote, Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. But perhaps Jung's most compelling example was himself. From 1913 to 1919, he endured what he later described as a psychological near breakdown, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. During this time, Jung experienced vivid visions, powerful emotions, and overwhelming perceptions that blurred the line between inner and outer reality. Yet rather than resisting or suppressing these experiences, Jung did something radical. He documented them in what would become the Red Book. Jung later reflected that his ability to survive this period came from the very work he was doing with his patients. He recognized that what he was experiencing wasn't madness. It was a surge of unconscious material, demanding integration. His superior perception had flooded his consciousness, but instead of letting it destroy him, he sought to understand it. This Jung believed was the true path for those with advanced perception, not denial, not withdrawal, but integration through understanding. He began to see superior perception not as a disorder, but as an evolutionary edge, a signal that consciousness was trying to expand beyond collective limitations. These insights shifted his entire therapeutic approach. He no longer sought to fix highly perceptive patients. He sought to guide them toward individuation, toward turning their burden into a path of transformation. But he also knew that no one could walk that path alone. He emphasized the need for what he called the few who understand people who could mirror your authenticity without fear, judgment, or defensiveness. Jung described 3 types of relationships that were vital for the highly perceptive individual. The first was with fellow individuated persons. These are rare individuals who have also gone through the process of confronting their unconscious and integrating their shadow. Jung noted that when these people meet, there is often immediate recognition. The individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately, he wrote. These relationships are marked by authenticity, presence, and mutual respect. There is no need to explain or justify perception, only a shared understanding that both people see. The second type of relationship involves those actively engaged in their own individuation process. These might be people in therapy, deep spiritual practice, or long-term self-reflection. Even if they don't possess superior perception themselves, they value it. They aren't defensive or dismissive. They may not see what you see, but they trust that you do. Jung wrote, "Those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others." The third group consists of what Jung called natural containers. These are individuals who, even without formal inner work, have developed the emotional maturity and stability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed. Often shaped by life experience, hardship, or deep empathy, they serve as grounding forces. They don't rush to fix or react, they simply listen. Their presence is medicine. To help identify these rare individuals, Jung developed what he called the recognition process. Safe people, he said, display certain consistent traits. They ask genuine questions, not defensive ones. They acknowledge their flaws without shame. They stay emotionally centered when confronted with difficult truths. And they show curiosity about inner growth. With them, the highly perceptive individual can finally relax because they are not too much. Jung also taught a strategy he called the gradual revelation protocol, a way for perceptive individuals to safely share their insights without overwhelming others or risking backlash. Step 1. Begin with light observational comments, not heavy interpretations. Step 2. Watch how the person responds. Are they curious or defensive? Step 3. If they stay open, gradually go deeper. Step 4. Always present insights as offerings, not absolute truths. Step 5. Maintain a grounded tone, no preaching, no emotional intensity that might trigger resistance. The purpose of this approach wasn't manipulation, it was protection. It allowed the perceptive individual to build bridges instead of being burned at the stake. Jung emphasized that the goal isn't to find people who accept everything you see. It's to find those willing to engage with what you see without fear. Because when integrated properly, this rare kind of perception isn't just a personal gift, it becomes cultural medicine. Jung saw these individuals as consciousness pioneers, those born with psychological insight ahead of their time. He believed they played a vital role in the evolution of human awareness. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, "The individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. Transformation doesn't come from institutions, it comes from awake individuals." He outlined 4 stages of this transformation for the highly perceptive individual. Stage 1. Recognition without overwhelm. This is when the person finally accepts what they are capable of perceiving, not as a curse or abnormality, but as a natural part of their psyche. Jung called this the beginning of wisdom, to see clearly and accept completely. Stage 2. Integration without isolation. The next challenge is learning to engage with others without withdrawing or deluding oneself. This means building the tools to stay connected while remaining authentic. It's about staying in the world, but not becoming of it. Jung called this social individuation, the art of being fully yourself in relation to others. Stage 3. Service without sacrifice. At this level, the individual learns to offer their perception as a gift rather than a burden. They no longer feel the need to carry others' pain or fix what isn't theirs. They understand that insight is meant to be shared, not suffered. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole." Stage 4. Legacy without attachment. The final stage is when perception is offered freely, without attachment to outcomes. The individual becomes what Jung called a transcendent function. A person who holds awareness without needing recognition, who contributes to evolution even if they're never acknowledged. Their service is quiet, consistent, and transformational. Jung warned, however, that even at advanced stages, the path is filled with pitfalls. The most common is inflation, when the individual begins to believe they are more evolved, more aware, or more important than others. This ego identification with the gift is deeply destructive. Jung wrote, "The danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships." Jung observed this inflation trap often. Highly perceptive individuals might begin to see themselves as saviors, those uniquely equipped to wake up the unconscious masses. But in doing so, they fall into what Jung called unconscious possession, where the very gift meant to be integrated ends up controlling the ego. He described this as a psychological mirage. The moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand. The second pitfall is withdrawal justified by superiority. Some individuals, overwhelmed by the lack of understanding around them, retreat entirely. They claim the world is too unconscious to engage with. On the surface, this may look like wisdom, but Jung saw it as avoidance. He wrote, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it." The hermit, in this case, hasn't transcended the world. He's been defeated by it. The third pitfall is what Jung called the helper's identity. Here, the perceptive person becomes addicted to being needed. Their self-worth becomes tied to their ability to help others. They define themselves through their function, not their essence. Jung warned, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the role. This is not individuation, it is the sacrifice of the self to the persona. The fourth and final danger is what he called the overwhelm return. Even those who have successfully integrated their gift can regress, especially during periods of trauma, grief, or significant life transitions. Old boundaries dissolve, emotional content seeps in, and the person once again finds themselves flooded. Jung emphasized that integration is not a final destination. It's an ongoing process. Integration is not a permanent achievement, he wrote. but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. To manage these risks, Jung developed what he called integration maintenance daily and lifelong practices that support healthy psychological boundaries. First and foremost, regular solitude. Time away from others allows the perceptive individual to sort through what belongs to them and what has been absorbed from the world. Second, conscious choice about when and with whom to use their perceptive abilities. Not every situation is safe for deep insight. Third, continuous shadow work. By acknowledging their own flaws, they prevent themselves from projecting or becoming inflated. Fourth, connection with grounded individuals. These people provide reality checks, support, and emotional regulation. Fifth, creative expression. Jung believed that perception without expression becomes toxic. Through art, music, writing, or movement, the intuitive person transforms overwhelming input into meaningful output. Jung wrote, "The integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity." Ultimately, Jung believed that highly perceptive individuals play an essential evolutionary role. In The Undiscovered Self, he argued that these people act as forerunners, individuals whose psychological development precedes society's readiness to evolve. He wrote, "What appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation." These individuals serve as living laboratories for consciousness itself. Throughout history, Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. Individuals with superior perception often show up before the collective is ready to receive their insights. They're like early scouts exploring psychological territories the rest of humanity hasn't yet acknowledged. He saw their symptoms, depression, anxiety, alienation, not as dysfunctions, but as signals that something deeper is trying to emerge. The sensitive individual, Jung wrote, feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their suffering is often not personal, it's prophetic. But Jung was clear the goal is not to become a martyr to perception. The mission is not to suffer for truth, but to serve it. The individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, he wrote, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole. This is the difference between burnout and contribution, between emotional collapse and cultural leadership. The highest form of integration, Jung believed, is lightness, the ability to perceive everything with depth, yet hold it with grace. To know what others refuse to face, but carry that knowing without judgment or superiority. To witness humanity's darkness and still choose love. He called this the transcendent function, a way of being that doesn't force evolution, but naturally inspires it by example. Jung's patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who once couldn't hold friendships or jobs, became one of his most successful case studies in integration. After 3 years of dedicated inner work, she found a role as a counselor where her perception became a healing force. She built friendships with people who valued her insights. Most importantly, she no longer experienced her gift as a curse. Jung wrote, she learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously. This was the essence of his most dangerous discovery, that some individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds the collective norm. If left unintegrated, it destroys them. If developed with care, it transforms them, and society along with it. You, the highly perceptive person, are not broken. You're not overreacting. You're not too sensitive. You are ahead of your time. The world may not be ready to see what you see, but that doesn't mean your vision is wrong. It means your integration is essential. Your gift is not the burden. Your unconscious relationship to the gift is the burden. Learn to integrate it, and you'll become exactly what Jung believed you were meant to be, a consciousness pioneer preparing humanity for the evolution it doesn't yet know it needs. If this resonates with you, don't keep your journey to yourself. Share in the comments what type of intuitive you identify with. And if you're walking the path of individuation, know that you're not alone. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more psychological insights that honor your depth. Let's evolve together.